what's very striking when you talk to judges and social workers and youth workers and others is that there's an almost universal sense that the options open to those professionals don't fully meet the needs of young people. And the lack of trauma-informed practice for young people who've experienced complex trauma in their lives, the lack of agency that they're able to give young people over decisions that are made about them, the way in which the system discourages working with parents in a collaborative and constructive way when young people are facing threats outside of the home. These are the kinds of themes you hear all the time from a wide range of professionals, and a sense of frustration on their part that their contribution is too limited or their options available to them are too restricted. So in a sense, there's a real opportunity here to rethink and to start from the place that we hear young people talk about, their needs, their very, in some ways, very straightforward needs to have trauma-informed practice, relationships that are sustained for them, a network of people around them who stick with them, including their family through difficult times, a voice and a sense of some agency over what is happening to them at a time of their lives.
One of the obstacles we have at the moment is that, particularly when we think about adolescents who need support, who need to be placed, they are the group that we know the least about. So we've actually got a group of young people, and some of whom have experienced lots of early childhood adversity, might have a whole range of needs, have circumstances that need addressing, and yet as a group we know very little about their needs. We don't have systematic ways of thinking about needs at referral or measuring needs. We know very little about outcomes. Then you've also got a workforce who are very skilled in understanding and ways of working with families, but you also have the family who can see that there is a disconnect between the part of the system that was involved in those initial decisions and the part of the system that is trying to re-establish those relationships.
We still have a care system that feels a bit like warehousing rather than accepting and acknowledging the trauma that most young people come in with now. And we know from all the research that having a trusted adult in your life is really key to recovery from abuse, neglect, trauma. And yet we're moving children around the system. The placements don't stick. And where we don't identify the need and we don't really work to understand what we can do to help children find a stable placement. You know, many children are in stable placements, but there is a group who are moving and who have some of the worst outcomes.
There's examples that come to mind when we think about the criminalisation of children in residential care, when you think about the sort of the system very often automatically responding to adolescents who become young parents, immediately assuming risk and pushing their children or their unborn children into a child protection space in a way that completely lacks nuance and is rails against our understanding of good assessment and partnership and so on. My other experience is of seeing children who I'm aware of being in foster care, then seeing them appear in residential care, and then receiving papers to pursue an application for a secure accommodation order, for example. So this trajectory, this sort of sad conveyor belt where suddenly the system says there's nothing more to do, save for ask the court for authority to, lock this child up for a period of time. And I think those secure accommodation proceedings, those applications they're really stark because the child is at court, often asking desperately not to do, for this to happen. If it's proceeding on the basis of a voluntary arrangement, the parents accepting of the proposal, they won't be legally represented in the proceedings, which is particularly stark given what's at stake. And then those plans for secure accommodation arrangements for children, that isn't a long-term, it's not even a medium-term response to meeting the needs of a child and planning for a child. There's supposed to be an exit, there's supposed to be a destination, and very, very often, I would say, in practice, I've seen that just not properly attended to.
When you're only in family justice and youth justice, when you're only intervening with young people starting to get involved, when they get to crisis point, because the focus becomes on the risk, what you end up with is then not paying enough attention to people's strengths, to their care, to their responsibilities. And very often with young people who've come into care in their teens, they've been involved in looking after parents who've got serious difficulties, looking after younger siblings when parents haven't been able to do that. And I think that's not recognised and valued enough, because we construct people as problems rather than appreciating their strength and their care.
What does a child-centred approach really look like when we centre a lot of our focus and work on adult reflections and what we think are the various different experiences? The fact that we know that minoritised children and young people, where are their voices and experiences being amplified, and who's talking about the structural and systemic inequalities which continue to permeate throughout all of those various different systems?
So whereas other parts of the system, so special educational needs and disabilities, duties around young carers, extending support entitlements for care leavers, weird term, no one's a family leaver, are they? I digress. Whereas those parts of the system have deliberately sought to become much more fluid, much more transitional, and have had some funded duties attached accordingly, safeguarding's retained this almost uniquely binary, quite quaint idea that you can neatly delineate between childhood and adulthood, as if adolescence isn't the very process of transitioning from one state to the other. Inherent in that is quite a binary notion of victimhood and villainy. There are goodies and baddies in this world, apparently. This real, I think, quite polarised understanding of capacity versus vulnerability.
Treatment of children, I think, in the youth justice system is often conflicted. The children involved in the youth justice system have a dual status. They're both a child, but then they also have a status as an offender or a suspect. So that can be in conflict. So by the nature of their age, all children are attributed differential rights-based treatment covering aspects such as healthcare and like living standards and education. And those rights are enshrined in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and the European Convention of Human Rights and in domestic law. But yet children who are in conflict with the law also then have additional rights. So, for example, the right to a fair trial. And that's not because of their identity as a child, but because of their status as a juvenile in the system. And I think it's this dual status that can present quite a conceptual difficulty between these foundational rights that are predicated on children's distinctive status and then their rights within the justice system that depend on their shared status with adult offenders.
People are now talking about the relationship between the youth offending team worker and the child as being important, and a clear prerequisite of effective forms of intervention. I think the family justice system probably does that a bit better and has had a longer term recognition of the importance of relationship. But again, I suspect that there is substantial scope for improvement there too. And one of the things which I guess sometimes gets in the way of it is kind of like what might be termed professionalism. And there is clearly there it's a question of degree. The line has to be drawn somewhere. But there is something about the increased professionalisation of social work, of youth justice work, which I think has tended to get in the way of, let's say, caring relationships. The notion of caring, of befriending, are ones which, to a degree, have been a little bit frowned upon as being perhaps unprofessional. And I think that we need to ensure that professionalism allows for caring too.
So contact with systems, it may sound odd to say this, but that in itself can be an obstacle to achieving good outcomes for children. And I think it's just really a cautionary message to all of us to be really careful and not just assume that contact with family justice or youth justice or child welfare system is a good thing, because we know from research that is by no means always the case.